This is a session which is really devoted to the earliest history of Lunar Prospector, because Lunar Prospector, for me at least, began in about November of '88. And I'll go through a little of that history, I guess, and Gay was already involved. And I guess both of you were through SSI. In any case,
This is
like
the
all
discussion executive agency.
Sorry, I'll let you finish.
Correct.
Could you possibly?
Anyway, part of my interest in this session was the fact that I am writing a book on how Lunar Prospector was done. And I'm particularly interested in making sure that everyone who was involved conceptually or actually working on it is given credit, because Prospector to me is certainly not a NASA mission. Those of you who do know me know I'm not a fan of NASA. And this was a very unique mission, which was a grassroots effort. A lot of people put their heart and soul into this. And I must admit that I was disappointed, which may sound strange, when it evolved to the point, after our having tried for about 6 years to find a way of getting Lunar Prospector supported, that we had to do what I said would be the last thing that I would ever want to do, and that's go into the NASA arena. And that unfortunately meant that the crew I had in Lunar Exploration Inc. In Houston, and all the other people who supported Lunar Prospector, had to be left behind, in the sense that clearly I could not take all those people out to Sunnyvale. Any attempt that I made on that, by the way, Lockheed was not interested in having any free history. Most of you do not know this, but well, I guess most of you know that our side of it in Houston was done through Lunar Exploration Inc., which Preston Carter and I had set up as a nonprofit tax-exempt corporation for our volunteer group of engineers to do our side of the job. And when I went to Lockheed and asked if they would be my industry partner, I was told that I had to kill LEI because they did not want to have any prehistory, even though Lockheed had, of course, supported my efforts to a small extent. During the Phase B development study that we did with Omni Systems Incorporated, to get the spacecraft designed, I was actually given a year's worth of wages and travel, that is, as a Lockheed employee, working on Lunar Prospector through our own little company, LEI. Lockheed simply let me work on it and charge all my travel and time to overhead. So Lockheed did participate in a very meaningful way in the earliest days. But when it got serious about becoming a NASA proposal, or a proposal to the NASA Discovery Program, then I was asked point blank to get rid of LEI because they were going to make this into a Lockheed show, which I was not particularly pleased about, but I had very little choice. So I am extremely interested in preserving history, and I always describe Lunar Prospector in every talk I give as a grassroots effort, and make every effort to give credit to those of us, Gay and SSI and everyone else who put a lot of time and effort into this program. And I am pleased, obviously, that this did come to fruition, and I do want to ensure that everyone shares in the experience as much as possible, and that's why I take great pride in coming to meetings like this, where I meet some of my old colleagues and can make sure that they participate as much as possible. So the purpose of this meeting was to go to the prehistory, because as I said, for me, Prospector began in its current form, and even for me there was a prehistory, which I'll go over, and I'd like to hear from each of the others. I was asked by Larry Friesen, who I worked with at Lockheed, if I was interested in doing this, because the Houston Space Society had gotten the idea of doing this kind of a mission. And so I don't know when they exactly started that, and we were not aware of the SSI effort, although maybe there were people who knew what the other groups were doing. I was not aware of SSI at that time. And so I said, sure, why not? You know, NASA's not doing anything. And I had felt for a long time, as you will hear, that this type of thing was necessary, and certainly from the community rather than from NASA. So we got together on Saturdays at the local Peeps Parlor and started discussing this. And then I started hearing rumblings about SSI doing something similar or being involved. And that issue, I said, well, who's, you know, who was doing this, who's running the show, who's responsible for it, because I had volunteered to be the project scientist, with the caveat that, as it should be, if you're going to take that responsibility, it would be my responsibility, and I would decide what we were going to fly and how we were going to fly it, and that was accepted. And then I suggested that Preston Carter become the project engineer. Preston and I had worked together at Lockheed, not in the sense of working together in the same programs, but every time he had a crazy idea, engineering-wise, he would ask me to support it scientifically, and vice versa. He would present these things to Lockheed management and be thrown out, of course. But nevertheless, Preston and I were used to, working on things which were outside the usual envelope. And so I had a great deal of respect for Preston. And by the way, for those of you who know Preston, he's at Lawrence Livermore Labs now. And he was the integration engineer for the Clementine payload. And he is now getting support for his program, which he calls, I can never remember the stupid name, something sword, Hypersword, which is a space plane to go for commercial travel back and forth across the Earth, as well as go into Earth orbit. And he's progressing very nicely on that. In any case, so that's how we got started with Preston, and I brought that up because by that time, when I asked Preston to come in, I'm going to have the story, we had already started interfacing with SSI, and SSI had taken the lead role in terms of finding the resources, doing the political activities, and providing the management. Preston and I, with LEI, would provide the scientific and technological support for the mission and take care of the spacecraft. So we had this joint meeting in March of 89, when I first met Rick. As I said before, even though you seem to have forgotten it, the key point to me at that time, knowing how NASA operated and knowing how difficult it is to do a mission inside NASA, let alone a mission outside NASA, was gaining credibility. And it was easy for me to define Phase A, which is the science objectives. I mean, it's not very difficult. So we were already through the whole Phase A development of the program. The key was, in my estimation, going into Phase B, which is the engineering design of the spacecraft. And Rick came to represent SSI's interest, and there was a pretty good crowd. I don't know, 100 people or something like that. It was a pretty good meeting. And you were sort of off in the background, as I recall, and you made a statement which was key for me, and frankly for my next step, and that was Rick pointed out that SSI had $75,000 to support a Phase B study. And in my estimation, and I believe it turned out to be correct, that was the key, because it's easy, talk is cheap, as the saying goes, it takes money to buy beer. The key was not only having a science goal, Phase A development level definition of the science objectives, but to have a credible spacecraft design, a credible mission design. Once you have that, you've got something you can put in your display window, so to speak, and talk credibly to the rest of the world. And when Rick said that, I said, we can do this. This is possible. And let me tell you what that meant in my mind. That meant we had a 1% chance of succeeding, which was a pretty good chance, given the fact that NASA goes through innumerable Phase A studies, a whole lot of Phase B studies, but it's Phase CD, where of course you start spending money and going to spacecraft. When Rick made that statement, I don't know if I talked to you and said, are you sure, Rick, or not? But anyway, it sounded credible, and I'm sure I queried about that, because this was key. My next step was to go to my management, which I already warned what I was up to, and say, look, this is getting serious. We have money for a Phase B study, and hence, I think it is possible that we could end up doing this. And that's when they said, well, go ahead. At that time, I must say I was still naive enough, and I don't think I'm very naive, to believe that the aerospace community with which we dealt in some of this work, as well as the science side of it, would understand that big missions were over or coming to an end, and that unless the aerospace community learned to do small missions in an efficient quick manner that we were not going to be doing lunar and planetary exploration. As such, I thought we were doing a favor to our community, at least the aerospace companies. I have come to realize that they don't care. After I got thrown out of their offices by saying, give us $1 or $2 million, each of you, Boeing, MacDac, etc., and being told that why should we help you guys to demonstrate that we can do missions for a few tens of millions of dollars when we get hundreds of millions of dollars for the same mission. So, and my answer, of course, was because you're not going to be doing that in the future. And of course, that was correct. We are not doing big missions anymore. And now Lockheed is scrambling to do Prospector class missions. So even though we thought we were doing the aerospace community a favor by demonstrating what we now have accomplished happily, they didn't see it that way. So getting back now to the prehistory, my own prehistory to Prospector actually began when I was in Germany. I think some of you know I spent 10 years in Germany teaching and doing lunar research. I proposed a program called Selena, which my interest was always lunar landers, or landers period. I was one of the principal investigators on the Viking landers, and I certainly wanted to be an Apollo astronaut. I never really was that interested in doing orbital science myself. I wanted to be on the surface, and I still do. After Apollo, of course, we had a lot left to be done on the moon, and I proposed, because I was invited to Germany to help get them involved in lunar planetary exploration of the type I did. And so I felt it was necessary to have a program. You can't educate students if you don't have something for them to do. And so I proposed a program called Selena, which was 34 landers, which would set up a Selena physical array of seismographs and heat flow probes globally over the moon, and the remaining missions would bring back lunar samples. And there's a long history to that. But one of the things I realized, there was a difference in the return sample mass and the station, the landers which were just set up the Selena physical array, and that was quite a bit. And I said, well, gee, because we're going to go into a polar orbit and land from that in an Apollo-type trajectory. And I said, well, gee, we could start throwing off little sub-satellites on all these missions that we're going to set up the stations, and basically do orbital science, because that was left undone. That's how my interest began in what evolved into Lunar Prospector. And then, how many of you remember Lady Base 1? You certainly do. Well, I since I seem to have nothing better to do than go on wild goose chases, I went and talked to him and worked with him a while. And I said, look, if you're going to build a commercial lunar base, you better get some credibility. You can't, go from zero to a $10 billion program with no development. I said, why don't you fly a small satellite and do the following? And it was, of course, the payload that I had already worked out, which then became the Prospector payload. And so he considered that, and we tried to do that. Of course, that effort was premature and fell apart. And so then, a few months later, Larry Friesen came to me and asked me if I was interested in helping to develop this polar orbiting mission. And of course, I had already thought about it in these various ways, and I said, sure. And so that's the prehistory as far as I knew, and I would like to hear from Gay and everybody else. Sure.
Okay, all right. I guess you need a mic. There had been a discussion about this for a number of years after we retreated from the moon, and people were looking for a reason to go back, and some scientists had suggested that the moon may have ice and permanently shaded crater areas around the poles. And NASA was planning a lunar observer mission. They were going to use the backup. If the Mars observer was successful, they were going to use the backup Mars observer to fly the moon. But then Congress canceled the backup. Mars observer was flew, but all of a sudden we had no mission to the moon. And everybody So that's when the brainstorming started, how can we do this privately? And SSI was very much involved with that. It's in the mid-'80s, around '85, and Jim French, I believe, at JPL. In the activist world, the L5 Society, Gordon Woodcock and Greg Bears suggested, well, let's make this an L5 project. And my first conference was '87 in Pittsburgh, and Rick Tumlinson tried to raise some seed money for this there. Now, I don't know if you were doing this for L5 or for SSI.
No, I think we were, well, I'll talk about it when I talk after.
But anyway, there was a couple of $1,000 pledged, and then nothing happened, and nothing happened. And I tried to find out what happened to this money. Actually, only about $700 of it was ever collected.
Right.
But Lori Garber, executive director of NSS, was sitting on the money. And so the next conference was Denver, and I was fired up by Rick and others to see, well, let's get something started. And I guess it was Morris Hornick who suggested I talk to this dynamo here, Gay Canough. Canough. And I had an idea which did not work out. It was an idea about funding. I said, well, let's see if we can get National Geographic interested and do it. They fund exploratory missions. Maybe they could give us some seed money. This never happened, but it served its purpose. It lit a fire in Gay's eyes, and she started working on her tell the rest of the story.
Well, that was '88, Denver '88, 10 years ago from this conference. And I thought it'd be really fun to come here and talk a little bit about what went on at that time for me. From my perspective, I knew about the SSI study that Jim French had done, and I knew about the Lunar Observer, and my feeling was that when NASA came along and said, oh, we're going to do it, all the activists kind of sat back and said, okay, do it. Well, then they didn't. It kind of went flop. And then everybody was kind of talking and brainstorming and saying, well, gosh, what can we do now? Can we do something, anything? I mean, this discussion we had at the hospitality suite in '88 was a really, really wild and woolly discussion about what can we do, how can we do it, and we got to talking about Lunar Polar Probe, an idea which had been floating around from various sources for a number of years, and we just talked, and I think we started calling. I don't know if we started calling it Lunar Prospector then, or if it was even before that.
It was a few months. No, it was a few months after that. You and I, and Rick, and Greg Marinack, and Jim Davidson, the five of us, were exchanging letters back and forth for several months, and there were about 5 names floated. I guess I floated Lunar Prospector, and everybody liked it.
And we talked,
Yeah. So we glommed onto that name, and the reason I like that name is because at the time, I started a business in '88 called Extraterrestrial Materials, and I was interested in asteroid mining, but it occurred to me at some point that long before you ever mine anything, you prospect first. So I like the idea of prospecting, and I like the idea of the moon because it only takes 4 days to get there. So about 2 weeks after that conference, I mulled all this over. And I called up Greg Marinack at the Space Studies Institute, he was the executive director at the time, and said, Greg, how about we do this Lunar Polar Probe thing? Can we actually do it? And we talked a while, and we got to thinking, well, yeah, maybe we could actually do it. And started going out and getting in people's hair. Now, I did an incredible amount of getting in people's hair, I'll let you know. I went on several wild and crazy missions. I worked at IBM at the time, and so I would leave on Friday night, fly to JPL to talk to somebody, drive down to San Diego on Sunday, and fly back on Sunday night. And once I got stuck in Newark and had to call my boss up sheepishly on Monday morning and explain to him why I wasn't at work. And you know, I flew down to Houston for that conference in March, which Jim Davidson was putting together. I was communicating with Jim Davidson all during that time, and he had told me about Alan here, that he would be there. So you know, we went to that conference in March, and meanwhile, we planned a workshop to be held in Princeton in May. It's basically going on, and the Space Studies Institute actually commissioned us officially to run that workshop. Okay.
Still called Lunar Probe then.
Lunar Probe. So that workshop was meant to be a gathering of the experts in lunar science and engineering. And we brought together a cast of characters. I have a sheet here that shows some of them. I have some slides that I showed, I think it was in '89 at the ISDC, about what was going on with the Lunar Prospector. So
I think it was, didn't we call Lunar Prospector by that time? I
Yeah,
thought we
By-
decided.
we
Yeah.
had decided
Yeah.
on.
by the time of this meeting in
December,
May, we had already started calling it
Yeah.
Lunar Prospector.
Yeah,
They just took the institutions a little longer.
yeah.
So this was kind of the cast of characters, some of the characters involved. We had Alan Preston. Al Metzger was an expert from the Jet Propulsion Lab about gamma ray spectrometers. And a whole bunch of other people. I listed Rick, Jim, Greg, but there was also John Lewis from the Arizona Lunar and Planetary Institute was there, and a bunch of other. I do have a whole list, by the way,
That's
of all
the
the
88
people.
meeting you're talking
This would be '89, May of
89.
'89.
about. Not the
Yeah.
88 one.
No, the first meeting was March of '89.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then,
Right,
then
okay.
a month later, 2 months later, we had the Princeton meeting.
Yeah.
And that was really,
Right.
that's when things got rolling, because we had
Right.
75K, and then Preston and I wrote
Sure.
requests for proposals after we came back from this meeting.
Right.
Yeah. So out of that meeting, we basically defined what in more concrete terms, the concept for the Lunar Prospector, what instruments it would have on it, which you'd already thought about a lot, and what kind of a philosophy we ought to take, which was probably just a sort of a coming together of minds that we all wanted the same kind of philosophy. This is another one I showed. This was our philosophy.
You need to annotate this chart. Jim wants it.
Oh,
Was
okay.
Jim there?
Jim wants to use it well.
Not at the conference, but at the.
Ah,
Be nice to summarize all our
Well, I'll
names,
mention it
yeah.
and you know, so we get everybody who's involved.
later. Good long.
There's a lot of people. Oh, yeah, we actually got NASA to agree to give us a surplus gamma ray spectrometer.
Oh.
Greg Marinac went and talked to people about that. And at that workshop, we had, you know, we actually wrote up our mission statement and mission philosophy and all that sort of thing. Now, after that meeting, we went off and Alan and Preston put together, I guess we called it at the time, we called it a requirements document.
That was a request for proposal.
Okay, and it turned into this request for proposals that the Space Studies Institute sent out to small satellite manufacturers to pose a design and essentially come up with a full design for a lunar probe. That was issued on August 15th, 1989, and a place by the name of Omni Systems won the bid. I think SSI spent something like $60,000 to get them to do a design, which they did. They did what I would call practically a full-up design, practically a design where you had blueprints coming out the other end. And they even built a mock-up of it, which was played with out in their parking lot in California.
Wait, come on.
Showed off for the cameras.
I'd like to point out, since you've got that up there, that the basic design that Omni built for us is not quite exactly what I flew, but it was different in the sense that when I had, when I went into the Discovery program and took the design to Lockheed, which I had then purchased for LEI for $1. Lockheed, of course, took that design and then started massaging it from the standpoint of their technology. And of course, instead of aluminum truss structure for load-bearing structure, we had graphite epoxy. But you will notice that Prospector, as it's flying around the moon as we speak, looks exactly like that. Very, very close. So everything that we had done, down to everything I could hold exactly what we had in terms of the requirements, the way the mission was to be flown, has been preserved. The only thing we missed in this program was that we did not get private funding for it. Other than that, every single objective that we had laid out 8, 9, 10 years ago has been accomplished. So we should all be very proud of that.
Yeah, and this is one of those rare cases where, maybe it's not so rare, people, a lot of times they feel very powerless about, can I do anything about space, can I do anything about anything? You can do something. It's not going to be free. You're going to have to spend money. When I did my taxes in 1990, for the 1989 tax year, I had spent $25,000 on Lunar Prospector. For travel and computers and all the things like mailings and phone calling and all that stuff. So I'm not going to say it's not going to cost you anything to do something, but you can make a difference. And in this case, it was extremely important that there was a design already done. When Alan submitted his proposal, think of how the committee that's reviewing this proposal, they're getting all these proposals for ideas, and then they get this one proposal that has a full-up design with it. It's a no-brainer, right? They're going to fund it. And so all that preliminary work and all that energy that was collected at conferences like this was really important in making this project happen. Let's see. I have several copies of this thing and also the Journal of Lunar Exploration and Development, which has the summary of the workshops and the conference in Houston and things in it. I brought a few copies of this. Please, take one as a little memento of the Lunar Prospector. I got them up here. And I got some other articles from various places, various copies.
They're all mine. Sorry, folks.
Take some home and enjoy, and also bring out my file cabinet there a little bit. Believe it or not, I have saved like 2 boxes worth of Lunar Prospector stuff in the beginning. And I especially want to credit Peter here for coming up to me in 1988 and saying, "Hey, Gay, what about the Lunar Probe that SSI is talking about?" Okay, he started it, with me anyway.
Yeah, I'd like to amplify what you said, Gay. As I indicated, even within the NASA framework, most missions that are conceived don't fly. It's a fraction of a percent that actually fly. As Prospector evolved and things changed and we couldn't get the money, and even my organization, LEI, had shrunk to about 6 stalwarts who, every time we thought that I found a way of getting it funded, we would get active again. But all the time I had the support of the National Space Society and all the people who were interested in this, and we kept it alive. We had the credibility. The thing that I and Preston were fighting for from the very beginning was credibility. Because if people don't believe you can do it, then you're never going to convince them to give you any support. And when I went to Lockheed and started talking to them, and I had this document in my hand and the design, this was real. And I said, look, we think we can do it. Is there anything wrong with this? And the answer was no. This can be done. In fact, the thing that annoyed me most was Lockheed said, well, sure, we do it for these costs in the black world all the time. And yeah, you can do it in 18, 20 months. So everything that we thought we could do, and I should emphasize that obviously people who were working on it with me in the JSC area were space scientists and space engineers. So we knew it could be done too, but it was still an admission on the rest of the community that was the management and decision makers based on what I had in my hand, which was supported with a mere $60,000, $70,000 plus. I didn't know you spent that much. We could have done the whole project and what you put on. This was important. It was the credibility that we were after. Once we had attained the credibility, then it obviously took many more years to do Prospector, but no time. And I talked to politicians on the Hill, and everybody knew that we could do what we were talking about. It was not just a pipe dream that people had, thought up in their sleep. This was a real mission. That's what kept it going for all those years. Rick, I'd love to hear what you have.
I'm just going to fill in little holes and gaps because there was stuff going on behind the scenes that just really wasn't public at all. And maybe be surprised at some of these folks. I started working at SSI, I think 85, right in there as a volunteer, and quickly was spending too much time there for their comfort. But anyway, we had a situation where we had somewhat recently finished the last tests of Mass Driver 3. And that had created sort of an identity for SSI as a legitimate research project. It had created breakthroughs, showed that we could throw a payload off the moon at escape velocity, those types of things. And had been sort of the flagship project. That was the one that got the international attention. That was the one that got SSI onto NOVA, those types of things. And we were looking around, and there was an internal debate going on at SSI as to what the future of the organization would be. This was when SSI was really peaking out. We were showing up at conferences, and we had organized recruitment efforts, and we were just rolling at that point. And basically, a lot of that was because there was a vacuum, all puns intended, with the space program going on as far as the kinds of things we were interested in, NTM type stuff. There, in this discussion, came up the idea of, well, how does SSI work in the future? What are we going to do? And I should have I've got a few, we did a few graphs, and we were going back and forth. We actually locked ourselves away for a couple of days in hotels and things with Jerry and the rest of us, trying to figure out what to do. And one of the ideas was that a couple of us were really pushing hard was that SSI needed the next flagship project that SSI could be identified with. And we needed something big and kind of that represented what we were about, and also obviously delivered the goods on some of the things we needed to clear up on what was called the critical path. And non-terrestrial materials was considered to be the one. Now, it was interesting that all the way through this, we all missed the big one, which was cheap access to space, which was kind of interesting. But we were focusing on the resources once we got there at that point. So we wrote up all these ideas for what SSI could do next, and one of them was the Lunar Prospector, and that went through around and around inside SSI. And Greg Marinac was really, I have to say, Greg was the one who locked into that idea. And Greg needs to get more credit, actually, than he has been lately. I mean, we're all getting credit on this, but Greg did a great job. We started looking at how you would do this, different ways. I remember there was, at one point, there was a solar sail version proposed. At one point, I've got the color slides with the mock-ups of this, there was an ion thruster version. I think it was one of Jim French's variations. It was going to be a gas can. It was going to be shot out of the shuttle on this one. It was going to take forever to get there, and use your basic street lamp technology to shoot its way there slowly. I mean, we were going all over the map, expensive, low cost, high cost. And we used to call up this fellow Ron Jones every few weeks and have him build a new model. And we would get confused with our other friend Ron. So that went on for a while, and again, still trying to figure out how to turn this into a real project. There were several things we did to really kickstart. One thing was realizing that the space community itself, the advocacy community, needed a flagship itself. And so we went out, and that was when we did Pittsburgh. That was planned. The whole thing was planned. We got in there and we said, okay, we're gonna, and I think Davidson was in on this too a little bit. I'm not sure at that point. But basically, we got in there and we said, okay, we're gonna go for this thing. And now, by this time, Gay was already involved, right? At that point, Pittsburgh.
No.
No, not yet. Well, you were doing some other subject at that point. were still playing with SSI.
Yeah, I was involved with SSI. I think I was still focusing on more on asteroids.
Asteroids
at that
and
point.
external. Yeah. And so we got in there and we said, okay, we're going to kickstart this. And the space movement needs something real. And we did a situation where we held up some money. And I think I slapped down some money as well. And we had somebody in the audience.
$100 challenge gift.
Yeah, I put down $100. I said, okay, we're going to get this thing going. And I think we had a couple of shills in the audience who had been planning. And okay, I'll match it too. And we're just, getting conspiratorial. And we were getting in there and working on it that way. We were having meetings. Another person who needs some credit here is Jim Muncie. Jim and I, at this time, there were some internal battles going on in SSI as to the interface that SSI should have with Washington, how radical SSI should be. Keep in mind that within a year of all this happening, we split off and founded the Space Frontier Foundation at that same Denver conference.
Right.
So we had gotten disillusioned and were pulling away. So there was some interesting things, and I have to admit, well, let me get there first. We put on the Houston Space Society was involved as one of the more aggressive. What happened was SSI had identified those chapters and groups of L5 that were active. They just surfaced. You'd spot them at the conferences. Who was doing real work? Davidson was one of those as well, and that whole Houston Space Society, which eventually split off on its own because it was frustrated. And so we ended up with a situation where we had SSI moving along, trying to produce this thing, and by having these studies and such. And then the Houston Space Society got involved, and the L5 crowd. And unfortunately, I think there was some miscommunication going on here and there. There was some distrust that was going on between Princeton and the activists. SSI had been working to have this very staid academic approach to things, and the activists in Houston were rolling along and almost getting ahead of SSI at times. And we were working in the background to try and get these engineering studies going. And Jim, and this is great because what had happened was an initiative. People were going for it. And we just hadn't learned how to work together very well at that point. So Jim went off and brought you in. And we brought in Gay about just around the same time. That all came together, I think, in the meeting in Houston at that point. And,
Well, no,
or Gay.
didn't you come out, you and I, somehow, Jim and the guys told me one day, about our third or fourth meeting, that, oh, by the way, SSI is doing something similar. I was
Right.
on the impression that then there were two completely independent.
It was going back and forth
Yeah.
because there was this unease going on, there was some
Yeah.
headbutting going on.
Well, I began to realize that, and that's why I asked the question, well,
Yeah.
who is running this show? What's going on? If somebody has to take charge, you can't have two completely independent things.
Right.
Didn't you and I, you came to Houston in January, didn't you?
Yeah, it was in the winter, yeah.
So you and I picked you up at the airport, we went and had Mexican lunch and sat down and talked about this and wrote out a series of, okay, we gotta do this, we gotta do it fast. I remember we were in perfect agreement. And so that was the first I kind of knew about
Right.
the meeting that we were gonna have in Princeton.
She was being like a missionary
Yeah.
from SSI, basically.
But we had
to bond
already,
that.
the Houston Space Society had already started setting up the workshop in
Right.
March, and that's when I started learning about your efforts, and that's probably when I started pushing
Right.
Jim and those guys to figure out who's running the show and what's this
Right.
thing called.
Right, exactly.
So,
And I was very eager at that time to make sure a rift didn't start. That's one of the
Yeah.
reasons I was willing to go down. I went down to Houston either 2 or 3 times over the course of 4 months, because I wanted to make absolutely sure that everybody was communicating and that, one group didn't start hating the other group, because I knew that
Right.
would just ruin it.
Right. Gay and I were both, I guess, interfaces with the activists in a way, and that was why I was sent down to the thing as well, to be sort of an
you were
emissary.
the only representative, were you, from SSI?
Yeah, I was sent there.
Yeah.
I hate to use the term, but the quote was for adult supervision. We didn't know.
Well, basically, I think the transition.
That was somebody else's
Yeah,
point.
the transition, I think, because there were many transitions.
Yeah.
Because obviously SSI sort of, faded in the background, and LEI kept it going. And
Right, well, that's what happened, yeah, that's what you guys
But
told me.
I think the transition was really between the March meeting,
Right.
which was the Houston Space Society effort.
And then the
And then
formal-
when Preston and I came to the Princeton meeting,
Right.
it was clear, I think we had already worked out the agreements, how we were going to run it. And
Yeah.
Preston and I were starting to talk about, okay, we're going to do this, and have, because we had 50 volunteers start from the JSC engineering community to come.
Yeah,
and
well, see, what had happened was Davidson found you.
Yeah.
They found you and they got you involved, and you were an unknown to Princeton. So that was one reason Gay was going down, was to begin that relationship building. And then Greg kept getting feedback from Gay, and then eventually myself, once I came down for that session, saying, you know, we got somebody real here. You know, we had Jim French, and we were able to then add you to the mix with a completely different kind of concept.
Yep.
And so that reality started building there. I should also say, it was very interesting. I'd love to see the list of people that was used to. I know Jeff Mander was there, for example,
Well,
who is now the American representative of Energia.
some of the list is in the registration packet. I had invited.
Were you there?
Of course.
Oh, good. Then we
Oh,
met
yeah.
before. It's a long time ago.
I had, so Jim Davidson's idea behind the conference was to have two tracks, one which would brainstorm the technical side, and one which would put together a business plan.
Right.
Now, at that conference, he had some declaration, which a lot of people
Oh,
at the
yeah, I remember
conference
that.
signed.
Right. We
Yeah.
signed the declaration.
Yeah.
Now,
We
in the
wrote-
registration, I had invited Jim up here, even though he's persona non grata to a lot of people. Because I
Especially
believe in truth and history.
Yes.
Yeah,
And Jim had an important role to
Yeah.
play.
absolutely.
He said he would come if we paid his way and gave him $1,000 and everything else, so I said, well.
Free enterprise.
Will you settle for giving us a statement? And he sent along a video, which is too long to play. But anyway, as part of the agreement, he wanted to put his Houston ad, Space Society ad in the program book. And I said, well, would you settle for the registration packet, because then you can make it double-sided and so on. I didn't want it in a program book. But it's in there, and there's some typos in there. On the flip side, where he's got that declaration, it says 1998, it should have been 1989, there's a transposition there. But some of those names are on there of the people who signed. Lori Garver was at the conference.
Lori Garver was there. There was just a whole crowd of us there, you know, many of us.
Now, part of the lack of comfort between SSI and Houston was from the business plan. I mean, everybody does use the tools they have.
Sure.
And here in Milwaukee, we had put together a competition to design a mission patch. Turned out to be- and that was, we decided on which the winning design in Houston. And Jim Davidson produced a lot of merchandise and tried to sell that to raise funds, because that's all what he knew how to do.
Well,
Of course,
see, that's the-
SSI was taking another tack of raising funds, and while we didn't raise them, we got pretty close. I think Merrimack pledges or letters of interest of $4.5 million.
There was a lot. There was a lot. To me, what's interesting.
Yeah, what happened to it?
The Bush recession.
The Gulf War broke out.
There are a couple of things that are, to me, what this is actually about was that this project came at, to me, one of the most critical transitions in the space activist movement. Because what was happening was we were realizing, and this was the actual symbol of it, we were realizing that it wasn't going to be done for us. And this is where, I mean, that's why you were, at that same time, you remember Jim Davidson having fights, and we were splitting off the Space Frontier, because there were groups of people who were saying, hold on, we got to do something. We've got to do it ourselves. We can't wait for the government. We were having those same fights in SSI. Are we going to be academic, or are we going to be active? And so this project, to me, symbolizes, in a way, that transition, realizing that we could create our own destiny in this field. And there were people that came down on either side of it. I want to give you a couple more data points as to some things that went on. There was this sort of fight also going on in SSI as to where to go with this. How far do we dip into the government, for example, for support? Jim Muncie and I were really advocating for an activist SSI, which eventually led to us and Bob Werb creating the foundation. contrary to popular belief, we didn't split off from an SS. That came from discussions with Jerry O'Neill about creating sort of a more action-oriented wing for for SSI. And we, Muncie was obviously working in the Washington domain, and worked as a lobbyist with us. So we went down, for example, and met with Congressman Torselli. I always do that. Torselli, and because he represented an adjacent area in New Jersey to Princeton, and it was one where Aeroastro, I think it was, or whatever the GE Aerospace, whatever the facility was there, the big satellite facility. And it was he had shown some openness to our faxes and such. And we went down and briefed him and asked him, we had heard, we needed a gamma ray spectrometer, we thought, and went down there and briefed him on this whole idea and pointed out to him that there was a leftover GRS sitting there from what was going to be Apollo 17 out at JPL in storage, and could we get it, handed over as surplus or something like that. And I want to give Congressman Torselli, credit, because he did help us nudge JPL in that area and gave us certainly a good listening.
He and 4 other congressmen wrote a letter to headquarters.
Right.
And then reluctantly, headquarters called Greg and me and said, well, we've been instructed, I mean, it was clear, we've been instructed to do this. So Greg and I went to headquarters, and we were given liaison, what was his name? I'll think of it in a minute. And, it was made quite clear that NASA was not interested in this. However, since Congress had requested that they donate the spectrometer to us, they would do so. And of course, Greg and I were gracious and said that we would keep them informed. And I will tell you right now, every time that we kept them informed, we got an ice cold letter back. Mm-hmm. Now, the history of that particular gamma ray spectrometer, Al Metzger, that's why I asked Al to be on the team, because it was sitting in his office, and he was the principal investigator during the Apollo 15 and 16 missions when it did fly, or its brothers and sisters. When we started talking about refurbishment costs, now remember, we thought we needed $10 million of dollars, plus donated equipment to build Prospector. And Al's refurbishment cost of the GRS was $2 million, and I said, thanks, but no thanks. Right. And to put that in perspective, the 3 spectrometers, most of you know the payload, I think, that we got 3 spectrometers in the MAG-ER. The 3 spectrometers, the Bill Feldman built, which is gamma ray, neutron, and alpha particle spectrometer, cost $2.5 million. So we've spent the same amount of money in the refurbishment of the old APS, which was vastly inferior to what we have now flown, for almost the same money. So, but the point was that since these 5 congressmen had written a letter, that again was a big step in credibility. And NASA's lack of enthusiasm for what we were doing, was expected. But I need to say this about the effects of that letter. One of my concerns, because I was from the Houston area, and some of you may remember the space industrial facility that space industries wanted to make, and NASA crushed those guys. I mean, they were ready to roll. They had the support. They had the design. They had, the best engineers, and NASA just crushed them. And my biggest fear from day one was simply that NASA would just come and squash this whole effort. But when those 5 congressmen wrote the letter, that kind of said, hey, put a little shield over us. And NASA was not warm to us ever, but it never did anything to stop us. And that was another important, in this case, a defense thing, because I am sure that NASA was. Let me jump ahead if I might interrupt. The lack of interest in NASA about what we were doing is told by the fact that, unbeknownst to me, the Discovery program started at the same time, philosophically, and they were developing a scheme. And here we were doing exactly, now, let history speak. Prospector was obviously exactly what Discovery was about, or I wouldn't be sitting here. And yet, they never mentioned it to us. In desperation, after we had failed to get money from the aerospace community, after we had failed to get money from the commercial community, et cetera, I then started talking to local congressmen from Texas and tried to get support. JSC, by the way, was behind this. I had great support from JSC. But this whole thing was developing parallel. Discovery knew of us, and we were obviously the proper concept, and yet I was never told. I even put in an unsolicited proposal to NASA in absolute desperation, and it was returned. I did not say rejected. It was returned. NASA is obligated by law to review all proposals it gets unsolicited. This was returned. 2 months later, they decided, gee, that's illegal, and did, review it and say we're not interested after having told us they were not interested. When they had the first meetings for the Discovery program, the San Juan Capistrano meeting, Pat Dash, who I'm sure everyone knows here, was working at SAI and supporting Code S activities, and she called up and said, why weren't you at the Capistrano meeting? And I said, what Capistrano meeting? She said, you mean they didn't put you on the list? The answer was no, and I even had to write to get a copy of the announcement of opportunities for the time. So NASA knew about what we were doing. It was obviously the right thing, and yet they made no efforts at all to involve Lunar Prospector in the Discovery program. So the protection we had from the
Right.
congressman was very important.
Well, that was one, that for us, for Muncie and I
I
especially,
hate to
was,
interrupt, but you guys have about 2 more minutes before the next speaker.
okay.
Our next speaker's him.
Yeah, so I'll yield a couple of minutes to myself.
Well, that works.
That's what you get for watching C-SPAN.
Hey, breaking news here.
Right, right. And, well, anyway, a couple of things just to toss in. I mean, one thing that happened with Jim and I was realizing through this effort that we could actually do things like this. That we could actually, with a focused effort, start getting things done using the Hill and stuff, and it helped inspire us for going off and doing our thing. Another interesting thing happened, and the 88 system study, the 88, Gabe, remember when we, I think we may be using different names for the same thing. It was in 88, we all gathered at that meeting place outside Princeton.
That was
the
89.
brainstorming.
That was 89?
That was May of '89.
The summer
gathered.
systems, lunar system study. And
No.
Freeman Dyson was there.
No,
That's something different.
That was
You
88.
locked yourself in a room.
We liked
for a
it.
while.
We had Freeman, we had
That was
O'Neill, we
88.
had
That was 88.
Bach. I think.
No,
you came.
my first
you came the next year,
involvement was
right,
when I did the prospect.
Right. Well, in '88, looking at this thing, we had broken into teams to do some studies, and this neatly segues, by the way, into Lunacorp. We had broken into teams, based on this prospector idea was moving in parallel. We broke into a bunch of teams. We had Freeman Dyson there. We had Pat Rawlings was in the back room generating pictures as we created concepts. A whole bunch of people were there working on these different things. And we divided the moon, or we divided sort of the critical path to the moon up into low Earth, Earth-Moon, orbiting, and then landers. And it's a fascinating little study. And my team was the landers, and we came up with a commercial lunar race called the Moon Race 2000 or something like that, where you would have like Mercedes competing with Ford and General Motors, and all the vehicles would be driven by famous race car drivers back on Earth, and this would cause a lot of excitement. And this was all based on the premise that Lunar Prospector was going to discover neat things, and this was going to start a whole new wave of doing these types of things. And some guys picked up on some of that stuff, and I didn't know it. And some of the other things that were being put out at SSI conferences. And by the way, I want to give a plug there to the SSI conferences. If there is one very, very valuable thing that SSI is doing and has been doing, it is those conferences, space manufacturing conferences. I've seen so many people go in there and their switch come on. Red Whitaker, well, I'll get back to that in a minute. But there are a lot of people that have come to these conferences. They sit there. They have no idea this stuff is going on. They hear these credible presentations in sort of Princeton academic setting, which lends credibility amazingly. And their switches go off, and they go out and start doing things. I mean, it is a great little thing to attend, and I recommend it for anybody. But I have to make one admission as I wrap up. I gave up on Lunar Prospector. I literally gave up on it. In 1989, seeing the schism between Houston and Princeton growing at that point, there were literally people were starting not to talk to each other and things like this. I got very frustrated. I was at the International Space University session in Strasbourg, France at the time with Marinac, and met with him, and I resigned. I said, this isn't going to happen. And I concurrently that day joined Lunacorp. Because I said, we're going to get there first with Lunacorp. I was wrong. I was dead wrong. And I have to make that admission, because I remember the meeting with Greg where I said, I just can't, this is splitting up in different ways, and it's just not going to happen, and I want to go out and I want to get real. Basically because SSI and these other folks had inspired us to go out and get real. And then, it kind of went away off my radar screen. And every once in a while I would hear things about what was going on with you down there. And then I started realizing eventually, oh my God, they're going to pull this sucker off. And you did, and I've got to say, I was one of those who lost faith.
Well, we all had a part in the beginning, but it wouldn't have happened without you.
This guy picked it up and ran with it. He went across the barbed wire. This is the guy.
The thing is, before this thing wraps up, I want to bring out what I know from the Houston Space Society aspect of all this.
Yeah, please.
Well, you were down there. You were part of
Pat,
that.
Pat and I based all the time.
So the thing is that what I wasn't in on the very beginning of it. I should have been, but we were at the '88 World Science Fiction Convention in New Orleans, and I knew there was a meeting going on where it seemed to be talked about, but there was something else I had to go do. And by the time I got back, it's over with. But I quickly learned that I should have been there because a bunch of the National Space Society people and other people who are space enthusiasts had gotten together, and apparently now, from what I know now, all this other stuff is going on. So it wasn't just created out of whole cloth, but they said, we got to do something, and we're going to get started with it with a conference. And the Houston Space Society said, well, we'll be happy to host it in Houston in March. And so I promptly learned about it, and I have a background in doing PR, so I promptly did the PR aspect of it. And we did get publicity on National Public Radio, American Public Radio, and some other places. Anyway, so the thing is that then we had the conference. Now, I have a strong background in organizing, so I assumed that at this group, at this meeting, we would organize. One thing I got involved with, Rick and I were part of the team coming up with the declaration, which was, we really wanted to have it as being a really strong, impressive thing that would really make a big difference in terms of the public realizing this is important. But what I didn't realize until the conference was over with is that nobody had organized a thing. It was just Jim Davidson with his completely inadequate understanding of things, and everybody was saying, hey, we're going to do things, but all they were thinking of doing to raise money was selling T-shirts and buttons. And so I think we total raised around $2,000, and everybody was enthusiastic about raising money. But we were looking at $25 million. It couldn't be done selling T-shirts and bumper stickers and pins. And so when I began to realize that there wasn't any organizing going on, I kept on trying to get Jim to understand, look, we need to have a board of directors, we need to have influential people outside on our board, we need to have committee structure, we have to have regular meetings, we have to have a plan of attack, a strategy, schedule if we're going to get things done, and they just didn't get the idea. And so finally, a year or so later, when really things had basically was not anything left, I said, Jim, please let me take it over. And she said, okay, fine. We had a big knockdown, drag out battle. And then we discovered that the then current president of the Houston Space Society, who was not supposed to have access to the Lunar Prospector Team Fund, had gotten access to it and stolen everything in it, all $2,000.
Oh, really?
Plus about the same amount in the Houston Space Society fund. And he eventually went to jail for other reasons, but anyway. And so, I gave up. I gave up. Because I said, look, there's a bunch of people who do not understand how the real world works. They've been very enthusiastically in selling bumper stickers, not realizing there's millions of dollars involved. Then I discovered that, and by the way, we had done some good. We bought something that Alan needed for his private study. We provided a room for him. We provided furniture for him. So we were the ones who made him have the first thing. And then basically, the people in the Houston Space Society, the other people who were part of the Lunar Prospector team, didn't care about it anymore. They'd done all this selling of T-shirts, but now it's all going, okay, no problem.
We have to break.
So then Alan got the idea to go to corporations and raise money that way.
Right.
But I could have told you at that moment you weren't going to have it happen because you didn't have an organization. And you didn't.
Well, let me comment. I appreciate your comments, but the reason Prospector worked is because we didn't have an organization, because we were not constrained by anybody. I was just going out with my group of people,
Yeah.
doing whatever we could possibly
Yeah,
do.
so, but the thing is, that that didn't work, as I could have told him it didn't. But then he kept on persisting to do everything he could, whereas the other people on the Little Prospector team had said, well, you're not gonna do anything more, well, too bad, too bad. He kept on, and finally, he made it happen. So even though we could have done it, it was possible for us to have done it, he managed to make it happen. So we helped him to get started on it. SHI and everybody else helped to make it happen. We all had a part in making it happen. But if it hadn't been for Alan's persistence, we wouldn't have had it happen.
Right.
Persistence pays.
Oh,
All
okay.
right, well, let me make a quick summary. I appreciate those words, but I truly, honestly feel that this is our mission. I may have carried the banner, but without everything that everybody did, and some of these revelations are amazing to me, because I was in Houston, and I never heard this. I didn't know about this split. Perhaps because Preston and I were off.
Well, you were the nice academic scientist, we didn't want to bother you.
Whatever. But in any case, two things I would like. Of course, I would like to get this prehistory. As you say, I want the prehistory of Prospector properly documented so that people understand how things like this come about. Some of you may remember when the Bay of Pigs occurred. Kennedy said, success has many fathers and failure but one. Well, Prospector is a success. And I know there are many, many fathers. Each of us came in from and mothers. Well, I'm speaking. And the first part of the book is the prehistory. And I really want everybody to get credit for the efforts they made, because without this, without every single effort that people made, this would not have come together. So I appreciate, the accolades, but they're your accolades. Please believe me. Yes.
Yeah, there's just a couple items of prehistory you might be able to throw into context. The MSDC at Miami University, there was one of the people from AMROC was there, the fellow who ran AMROC at the time. I can't remember his name. George. No, not Koopman. AMROC. Oh, I'm sorry, not AMROC. I mean AMSAT. Sorry.
AMSAT.
Okay, AMSAT. The fellow who ran AMSAT was there, and he gave a talk about how they were going to do a geosynchronous AMSAT. And then at the party that night, Gordon Woodcock and he got to talking about whether, okay, if it's already in geosynchronous, it would be very easy to get it out around the moon. That was the first time that I had ever heard anything about the concept.
What year was it?
It would have been around 86, I would guess.
Yes.
Now, the next that I heard about the thing was at the Lunar Base Symposium, which was, I think, was that
The SSI
87? No, the Lunar Base Symposium in Houston.
Oh, okay, Wendell Mendel's.
Yeah, that would have been about, was that 80? Was that 88?
Early May of '88.
The one with the big.
Yeah. At that, there was a meeting with Gordon Woodcock and I think Jim French and a couple others that were discussing whether they could get a payload launched.
And Wendell Mendel was one of the reasons you were getting support
Yeah.
from JSC.
Well,
Lunar planetary.
the real support came from Hofstetter.
Yeah.
He ran the new initiative office, and Bill and I talked about this many times, and Bill was extremely supportive. Now maybe Wendell was behind there too, but Bill, I always personally owe a great debt of gratitude to Bill, because Bill championed this. He championed it with Aaron Cohen. Aaron Cohen took it to Golden.
Right.
And so I had tremendous support from Bill. So there are a lot of people that are behind this, and as I say, it's all ours. Lunar Prospector belongs to everybody in this room. It's
Please
not a
correct
NASA
anybody.
mission. Oh, one final thing I have to say, because people have asked me about this, and that's why there's no credit given to the early efforts. As I mentioned to you, I was forced to even drop LEI by Lockheed, and there was every effort to make this look like a NASA Lockheed program, to the extent, by the way, the principal investigator is from Lunar Research Institute. You will notice that my logo is not on the rocket. There's nothing said about LEI. So you may feel bad that you weren't mentioned, but believe me, they did everything and still do to keep this looking like a NASA Lockheed program. And there's all one can do, Peter, is get it out, and that's part of the purpose of the book, to make it clear how this happened. So I do hope you guys will send me copies of what you have, and I will try to integrate it in. This is fun. Yeah, all these themes that were
Just
involved.
rolling along, it's very Machiavellian.
Well, thanks a lot. actually do this again sometime when there's an unrestricted time, because I'm sure there's a lot more.
When everybody pulls this together.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I'll bring the SSI slides and
Yeah,
stuff.
that would be good.
For example, I must say, I think one of the things, by the way, that led to the logo, Peter, was that Greg was using in his slideshow for a long time, and Jerry used it too. He would talk about prospecting on the moon, and he would show this cartoon of a prospector with his mule in a spacesuit. And he said, "This is my version of a prospector." And the guy's carrying a pickaxe. And I think that helped lead to the design that this gentleman, could you stand up and show us your chest? That was the logo right there.
That was done by a Milwaukee artist named Bill Bird, and he was supposed to be in the conference.
I actually think I have the original piece
Right.
in my files in the
And
front of the Space Frontier.
the original design just said Lunar Prospector. We dropped, it said mission, or what it was,
Team member.
and it was your idea to
Oh, it was
add
the one.
team member.
Because we wanted to give people ownership of their
Right,
writing.
rather than the mission patch,
Yeah.
it became the team patch.
Right.
By the way, stand up again. This says Lunar Prospector 1. When that design was shown us down, or when David brought or whatever and said, because I had said, hey, this is the beginning of more than one. And then Greg said, hey, if we say Lunar Prospector 1, there's an implication there, and a lot of people are going to back up. So we then scratched
I remember
off.
that discussion.
Yeah, but believe me, there will be a 2.
Like, we can barely get this one going.
My plan is for 2, 3, and 4. So this is not the end. Yes. So keep that to you.
This is fascinating stuff. I love this. I mean, to me, you know, again, as a summarizing thing, this was the adolescence of the space movement. Lunar Prospector symbolized the adolescence, the growing up of the space movement, from a passive movement that was believing other people, NASA, some saving grace was going to come in and put us out in space, to the realization that we could do it ourselves. And you had all of the aspects that you see in adolescence. You had people leaving home, children leaving home, yelling at their parents. I mean, it was the whole sort of thing. And lo and behold, we produced something here.